He's such a good kid. At some point, I had to work to get him to understand that $21 million was different than $3 million. I said, get your ass out of here. Go. You've got to do it. But he felt bad.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast, brought to you by Fantrax and Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and as always, you can find me on Twitter at redrock_bball. Today's podcast, we're going to be looking at a special podcast. I'm joined by a special guest. We're going to be looking at quite a number of things across the NBA landscape. And well, let me introduce the guest now. I'm joined by, you know who this guy is. It's ESPN's Kevin Pelton. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's good to have you on, Kevin. And look, we've got a number of things we want to talk about today, so I'm not gonna muck around. Let's get straight into it. The first thing I want to talk to you about is an article you wrote a week ago maybe, about NBA future rankings, future power rankings. And it's something that people that play fantasy, especially people playing sort of longer term dynasty leagues, projecting your future performance of players is something that's it's inexact science, I think. And a lot more work sort of needs to go into it. But you do a lot of that future performance projection stuff. How do you go about doing that in terms of working out stuff like those future power rankings? What goes into it?
Well, it's definitely inexact. Yeah, it's more of forecasting a range than it is probably a specific outcome, even though that's usually what we present. So for the actual future power rankings that I do with Chad Ford for teams, that's based on a formula where we rate, the two of us combine to rate teams in 5 categories. The players currently on their roster based on, their contract status and our expectation that they'll still be on the team over the 3 years window that the future power rankings cover. Their draft picks over the next 2 years in that case, that will affect that next 3 seasons. Their cap space over the next 2 summers, again, same thing. The market in terms of how likely they are to sign, quality free agents, and then team management. So those are what go into that. And it doesn't always match up, I think, to what I also do to try to help inform this is I use my multi-year projections for players to kind of inform what I'm doing with all of that. And those are based on so my Shaney projection system takes guys' last 3 seasons, weights those, regresses them to the mean a little, and then based on similar players, projects how they're going to do next season, and then a separate thing that projects how valuable they're going to be over the next 3 seasons. And that kind of helps inform the players part of it, but the actual future power rankings themselves are a little bit more subjective, more art than science.
The Shaney projection system is something that you've done for quite a while, and it's something we're going to refer to throughout this show quite a bit because I think it's obviously a well-respected system, and you look at players' production in terms of regression. I think that's key in terms of fantasy as well. We're going to get to that a little bit later. One team I do want to talk to you about, and there's a few things I want to talk to you about with this team, and it's the Denver Nuggets. When you came out with your season projections with the RPM system as well, you had Denver looking a lot higher than most people did. I think around 40 wins you had them projected for. They've got a stack of young talent. You see all these guys. We see a lot of young depth on this team without any real sort of clear standout all-star candidates at this point. How does your Shaney system look at that? Is it which guys are standing out with Denver? Is it looking in terms of looking at them future-wise? Are their projections looking to get these guys significantly better over time, or is the minutes? Do you see the minutes of all these players impacting on each other and that impacting what they can do moving forward?
Well, I would say that Jokic, I think, to me, is the guy who can be the centerpiece for them. I mean, certainly if you talk about RPM, which is real plus minus that we have on ESPN, which incorporates individual advanced player stats but then also, adjust the adjusted plus minus, which adjusts for how the team does with you on or off the court based on your teammates and the opponents. And he was a standout in that last season. I believe led all centers and was top 10 in the league. That's, probably a little bit fluky for him to perform that well at such a young age. But, still, even if you look just at his box score advanced stats, he was, right there with Kristaps Porzingis, not far behind Karl Anthony Towns. And so I think he's got the potential to become an all-star center alongside Towns in this league, which would be really interesting if, those two guys who both came into the league last year eventually, are battling each other for spots on that roster and, backing each other up there, that sort of thing. But then beyond that, it's just the number of different prospects they have and a lot of, talented guys, intriguing prospects. Emmanuel Mudiay wasn't very good as a rookie last year, particularly in the first half of the season, but did get much better, shoot the ball much better in the second half, turn the ball over less frequently. And, he's so young that I think when you project him out, 3-4 years down the road, he can become an average or better point guard, and that suddenly is a huge upgrade from where the Nuggets were last season and where they are now. And a number of different candidates. I like Jamal Murray as much as anyone in this year's draft, outside of Ben Simmons, then Yusuf Nurkic, who 2 years ago was outstanding for them as their starting center when he was a rookie, kind of had that job usurped by Jokic last year when he was injured. Now they're going to see if those two guys can fit together. I like Juancho Hernangomez, who they drafted in the first round this year, gives them a little bit different presence in the front court because they haven't really had that stretch four other than Jarrell Arthur, who's probably not part of their long-term future. So, those are guys at multiple positions. Gary Harris was one of the leading most improved player contenders in my mind. Basically every position except small forward, where right now they have Danilo Gallinari. You look at them as having a quality young prospect everywhere else.
With Jokic, he was... Not only was he the best center by real plus minus last season, like his rookie season was historic in a number of advanced statistics. He was top 10 all time in box score plus minus as well. He put up huge numbers. Now in fantasy, he's been overhyped a lot this year. His rankings have gone through the roof. And people are a little bit worried about the way that him and Yusuf Nurkic can potentially fit together, and even the way that Nurkic is playing in preseason in terms of Nurkic overshadowing Jokic, pushing Jokic out of his natural position to the fore and playing those two guys together. How do you see those two guys fitting together? And if Jokic is playing further away from the basket, do you see that hampering his abilities or his ability to rack up the stats that he was last season and be so efficient in all areas of the game?
Well, it's definitely more of an adjustment for him, I would say, than it is for Nurkic, because of the fact that, Nurkic is just going to do what he does, bull in a china shop kind of routine in the paint. Whereas Jokic, because of the fact that he's more skilled, such a good passer for a big man, can step out and hit the three occasionally, which is one thing I think to be encouraged about his upcoming season, is the fact that we often see European players or players who come from international leagues. It takes them until their second season to really adjust to that NBA three-point line, and they shoot much more accurately from downtown in year two. So that would help make that a lot more effective, those duos, if he's able to shoot the three and be a real threat out there. But yeah, he's not going to have the same kind of low post touches that he did last year, and he's definitely not going to rebound the same way he did last year if he's playing with Nurkic. The one thing they'll probably, my guess is they're probably playing them a little bit more together in the preseason than they will in the regular season, just because they probably want to try this out and see what it looks like. And then, B, you're using slightly different rotations during the regular season. You're probably going to be staggering those two guys and make sure that one of them is on the court at all times.
Yeah, that's the way that I sort of look at it. When I try to work it out, I think they'll probably play them together between 8 to 10 minutes would be my guess at most. And then you have Nurkic playing center, and then when he goes off, Jokic plays center, because they don't have any other centers on the team at all, unless they want to go really small and play Kenneth Faried there, which doesn't seem like an optimal way to go, especially when you've got Jokic and Nurkic who can both play that position. You mentioned Darrell Arthur. We haven't seen him really play throughout preseason as well, but you touched on him before, and this is a guy that when you did your rookie projections, he came out extraordinarily high. I think he was in your top 10, and that's Juancho Hernangomez. What about him do you like, and do your projections like? Because obviously he was ranked in your list a lot higher than where he was actually drafted, and a lot higher than where a lot of people have seen him. But I've been really impressed with him through Vegas and through what we've seen in our preseason so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing for him is he was a guy who was starting and playing regular minutes in the ACB, which is the best domestic league outside of the NBA anywhere. And we've seen a lot of young guys who have been successful in the ACB. I mean, Kristaps Porzingis most notably so, but those guys come in and translate that success fairly quickly to the NBA, and that helped his projection a great deal. That track record of other guys coming from Spain to the NBA, and then I think the other discrepancy is the fact that my system, this is actually my wins above replacement player metric, gives players credit for attempting threes because of his value in terms of floor spacing, regardless of whether they go in or not. And so that's someplace where he benefits as a guy who's a stretch four, as compared to systems that don't value 3-point shooting as much.
I think in terms of people looking at dynasty formats in fantasy basketball, Hernangomez is a guy that you should be looking at in terms of people having their rookie drafts. You should be looking at him. Look, I think he probably plays his way into some minutes this season, not a huge amount, but moving forward, I think you're going to see a lot more out of Hernangomez. I'm with you on him. I think that he was a guy that probably should have been picked a little bit higher than where he was, and it's worked out well for Denver with a lot of these international picks so far. One more thing on Denver, Jamal Murray, what's his best position? Do you think that he can play the majority of the time, or is he just going to be that combo guard who backs up Harris and backs up Moutier and gets 26 minutes a night going forward, but behind both these guys throughout his first few years of his career?
I look at him as a little bit like CJ McCollum, where we see how effective he is when he's playing alongside Damian Lillard, but then is a good enough ball handler and certainly shot creator that, when Lillard is on the bench, the Blazers have turned McCollum loose as the backup point guard. So I see something like that, and I think eventually a role like that, if he develops the way that we hope and expect, is a guy who, I think was a contender to go as high as 3 in this year's draft. In that case, I think eventually he probably will supplant Gary Harris, as nice a role player as Harris is, and then probably be in that same role, and Harris becomes kind of the Allen Crabbe to their Lillard and McCollum eventually.
Okay, so you think that I really like Murray as well. I think getting him at 7 was a real steal for Denver, another steal for them in the draft. So you think that he projects to be a starter over Harris, despite the way that Michael Malone has really loved Harris last season and seems to be committed to him at this point. You think that Murray can overtake him in a couple of years' time?
Yeah, I mean, I think if he gets to that point, if he's as effective offensively as he's got the skills to be, then yeah, it's going to be hard to keep him out of the starting lineup at that point. But those 3 guys, that we'll see if there's enough minutes to go around for all of them, since at this point you also have Will Barton in the mix, eventually Malik Beasley, the other guy they drafted in the first round, who's probably not going to play much right away. But those 3 guys in some combination, they're all going to be on the court for a solid number of minutes.
In general, when I look at your rookie projections, you seem to favour the European guys more than a lot of other systems, more than a lot of other, say, guys who are doing it purely based on scouting. That you seem to put the Euro guys a lot higher, so you were higher on Kristaps Porzingis last season than a lot of people were. What do you think that is just to do with your formula and your projection system, or is it more of a sign of the talent from Europe, not necessarily catching up to the talent from the United States, but you're getting more players, the overall quality of these guys getting better, and a lot of them being superior to the players that we are seeing in the United States. Do you think that's the case, or is it just a way that they play with the more 3-point shooting big men that they have being more favourable in your system?
Well, it is interesting because of the fact that I think this trend has really kind of only existed over the last 3 or 4 drafts now. Yeah. Going back to the draft where Nurkic, Capella, Jokic were all, I think, either in my top 10 or close to it that year. Before that, I really hadn't been that different. There might have been a European guy or two. Ricky Rubio was someone who came out really well in my projections, but it wasn't like that consistent trend of a couple guys in the top 10 every year like it has been lately. So I guess it probably is more about the evolution of the European game, and then just the success these guys are having, because of the fact that I'm projecting players that are coming into the NBA as draft picks based on the success of guys who have been coming in. The fact that, Capella and Nurkic did pan out, and Jokic, it buoys then the projections for the guys coming down the road.
For guys looking, again, in dynasty formats, there's 3 Europeans who are taken in the first round who aren't coming across to the NBA this season. Furkan Korkmaz for the Philadelphia 76ers, Ante Zizic for the Boston Celtics, and Gershon Yabusele for the Boston Celtics as well. With those guys, which of those guys do you get most excited about when looking at your projections? I've got a clear standout in that group, but do a lot of those guys really look positive to you?
To me, it's Zizic of those 3 guys. It was, we go back to, again, the success that these guys have had coming over lately. Both Nurkic and Jokic were playing in the Adriatic League, where Zizic was last year, along with briefly Ivica Zubac, who's now with the Lakers, who did come over right away. And his numbers are not quite at those guys' level, but pretty solid in their own right, given his age. So I think he's someone who can become a rotation player for sure in the NBA. Yabusele didn't come out as well, and he had his moments during Summer League, but also looked a little bit of a ways away at times. Korkmaz, really good offensive numbers. The issue for him is he has a really low steal rate, I believe also a really low rebound rate, although it's been a while since I've taken a look at that, and that's what I think really hurt his projection with me, is the fact that he wasn't a well-rounded contributor at both ends of the court.
Zizic was the guy for me as well. I think he projects out really well. He just, during the week, had a 37-point, 20 rebound game, playing over in that Adriatic League at the age of 19, which is obviously, it's an incredibly huge performance. And with the Celtics, the way that their sort of contracts are set up at the moment, Kelly Olynyk's a free agent at the end of the year, Amir Johnson's a free agent at the end of the year, Tyler Zeller's got a non-guaranteed deal for next year, so he could be potentially brought along. They could shed that salary, and he could almost immediately fit into a rotation spot if he comes over next season. So he's definitely a name to watch, because he does have this real ability to rack up statistics in a pretty significant way. So he's a name that you guys need to pay attention to if you're not looking for contributions this season anyway. Zizic is one of those interesting players. Now let's look at the Minnesota Timberwolves, Kevin, because they're a team that everyone is pretty interested in, pretty excited about the addition of Tom Thibodeau, the evolution of Andrew Wiggins, Karl Anthony Towns, Zach LaVine, the addition of Chris Dunn. How do you look at this team? How does your projection see them? Do you see them as a playoff team? Do you see them as a potential playoff team, or just a marginal increase on last season?
So the RPM projections we did this summer had them at about 37 wins. But what's interesting about that is it doesn't factor in the coaching aspect at all. It's just player performance when you're doing those projections. And so I think, if I recall correctly, Minnesota was projected there to be like 27th in defense. And if Tom Thibodeau ever oversees a defense that ranks 27th, I would be stunned at that development. So I think they're going to be even better than that projections looks like, and I think there is a realistic chance of them getting to 500 this year. I was a little surprised that their Vegas over under was as aggressive as it was. I believe 41.5. So I still might take the under on that one, but I've done some research on Tom Thibodeau's value in the past to try to establish that, when there was the brief talk about could the Bulls actually trade Thibodeau to get some value for him before they eventually ended up firing him. And at that point, my suggestion was, his value in particularly at the defensive end is somewhere in the order of about 5 wins. So when you add that on top of, just the internal development of all these young players, the fact that they've gotten a little bit deeper because their starting lineup in the second half of last season was as good as it was, all of that to me points to 40 wins, I think, being very realistic.
In terms of that starting lineup, the questions that people have when looking at the Timberwolves players for fantasy, because they're legitimately got 5 guys who could be top 50 fantasy guys, but the concern is with Thibodeau coming in is how does he treat Zach LaVine and his defense? How does he view Gorgie Dieng? Does he view him as a full-time starter at power forward? Do you have any sort of inkling as to what they do with, especially Dieng, especially given the way that Thibodeau has been running Nemanja Bjelica in preseason, giving him a lot of play, and he is that stretch forward? Do you see that being a threat to Dieng's minutes, or do you think that Dieng gets enough at the 4 and then just moves into a backup role behind Towns as well?
Yeah, it's been interesting to me. Yeah, when I kind of was thinking about this in my head coming into the season, I was expecting Bielitsa to be a little bit of the odd man out here, just because of the emphasis that Thibodeau puts on defense. He's generally, other than briefly with Nikola Mirotic his last year in Chicago, he's played two traditional big men together. So it seemed like that Towns combo, especially then after they went out and signed Cole Aldridge and Jordan Hill, they signed two more big men in free agency. It was like, I don't know, Bielitsa might get squeezed out, and Jang is probably going to be the guy. But yeah, so far, like you say, Bielitsa has actually played a little bit more in the preseason. And what's interesting is, Hill has barely been part of the rotation at all, which I think is an encouraging sign that's the case, because Bielitsa certainly deserves to play. But, like I said, that starting lineup with Jang and Towns together, as much as you want to talk about the lack of floor space and with that group, that lineup was extremely effective, particularly at the offensive end last season. So I see no reason to really move away from it. And yeah, I think, if you get creative with rotations, it's actually somewhat easier probably in some ways if Jang starts, because of the fact that you've got, Aldridge is the one guy coming off the bench that he's going to be a center no matter what. And I don't know that you want to play Aldridge and Jang together. So if it's an Aldridge-Bielitsa combo, and then, you do slot Bielitsa maybe in with Towns a little bit to get him those minutes in addition to the Jang-Towns combo, then that's maybe what ends up making the most sense for them.
Yeah, I was with you in terms of I thought that Bielitsa would struggle to get minutes, but obviously that's not the case at the moment. Now, one of my favourite things to do on the internet at the moment is to have arguments about Ricky Rubio, Kevin, because Chris Dunn's come in at pick 5, so everyone's, Rubio's done. He's out the door. He's finished. He's worse than Chris Dunn. He's going to get injured like he always does, and I always take umbrage to that because he wasn't injured at all last season. He's had 2 injuries in his career. They've just happened to be significant long-term injuries that have cost him 60 games at a time. What is your take on Chris Dunn? How does your projections view him? And how do you view Rubio? Because to me, Rubio is a significantly better passer, a significantly better defender, a marginally worse shooter, and he's only 2 years older. So I love having this argument because people are just like, Rubio's finished. I want to hear your take on it.
Well, I think it was some of that same thing where everyone was kind of projecting what they expected from Tom Thibodeau. And in that case, Dunn is the guy that he and his new front office with Scott Layden drafted. He's kind of more of the stereotypical or traditional point guard defender in terms of, his physicality and his size at the position, despite the fact that Rubio is accomplished, I think, certainly in terms of RPM, is almost anyone in the league at point guard defensively. And then, the potential to be a slightly better outside shooter and, more reliable guy in like a playoff scenario than Rubio was. But the other aspect of it is, Dunn is going to take some time to adjust to the NBA. He's struggled so far in the preseason with his shooting. As excited as everyone was about his summer league, that was 2 games that he played before he suffered a concussion, was knocked out for the rest of the summer league. So people probably got a little bit ahead of themselves on Dunn. And then the other thing, as you point out, is, everyone looks at Dunn as this young guy because he just got drafted. But he is 22, and Rubio came into the league so young that despite being an experienced NBA player, he's still relatively young and maybe not entirely done developing himself.
Yeah, basically everything you said there is stuff that I've been saying, on here and in written form in many areas. But a lot of the times I feel like I'm shouting to people who aren't listening. I'm still very much a believer in Rubio, and I think that Dunn could potentially have more of an impact on Zach LaVine this season than on Rubio, because what Rubio can do is significant for this team. We've seen historically his on-off numbers, all his advanced stuff has been significantly in his favor through his entire time in Minnesota, and when he doesn't play, they look a lot worse. Utah, another team that your projections are really high on. I am as well. I think that they should be looking at the 4th seed in the Western Conference. That should be where they're aiming. Now, the injury to Gordon Hayward and the fact that Derek Favors isn't playing at the moment is a little bit of a concern, but the guy I really want to focus on is a player we haven't seen for 12 months, and that's Dante Exum, who has looked really good in preseason. He had that great defensive play against Jamal Crawford the other day. He scored, I think, 18 points against the Suns. How did you see him coming into the league as a rookie? And he was obviously hard to project because you had no stats to base it on. And how has that changed from now?
Yeah, I tried to project him based on, I think it was, 6 games he played in the FIBA U19 or U17 championships. which was really kind of his highest level competition at that point, other than the one game with the Nike Hoop Summit where he really, established himself as a top prospect in the eyes of scouts before his senior year of high school in Australia. And yeah, so I actually had him based on that, and based on the fact that I kind of wasn't sold on a lot of other guys in that draft. I had him number one on my subjective personal board in that year's draft. And, then based on his rookie season, that looked like it was probably a bit too aggressive, although, he proved a really good defender right away. He was not the kind of player we expected in terms of his offensive passivity and how much he just spent time playing in the corner, but then also was really advanced defensively, and part of Utah really taking off after the trade deadline that season, when they also promoted Rudy Gobert to the starting lineup. So I guess what's encouraging then about his preseason so far is he's been making plays. He's been doing things. Like last night, he forced a 3-pointer and missed badly, and I was still happy about it because of the fact that I just like seeing him trying things and being aggressive. And we saw a little bit of that from him in the one summer league game he played for the Jazz after his rookie season. He sprained his ankle in that one game, but he looked terrific before it. And then, his next game action after that was with the Australian national team, where he ended up tearing his ACL. So we've seen some flashes of it now. And it's exciting because it shows that he's got the potential to be a guy who can create his own shot and get into the paint and create for others. And then layer the size that he brings and the defensive potential he brings on top of that. And that's where, he becomes that kind of elite prospect that we thought he was going into the draft.
Yeah, I'm with you on all that stuff. He was fantastic in that one Utah Summer League game that we saw last season. He was really aggressive at getting to the rack. And one thing that I always look at, if a player is a positive defender as a guard, as a rookie, it generally tends to mean good things, because a lot of guards are negative defensively, especially rookie guards. They can be atrocious defensively. And if he is not only just average, but a significant plus in that area, the other parts of his game will come along, and it's starting to come along now. So in terms of this season, look, he might crack the top 150. It's going to be hard with just all the guys there. Alec Burks on the bench trying to take his minutes, George Hill and Rodney Hood above him in the rotation. So he might find it hard to get enough minutes, but moving forward with George Hill being an unrestricted free agent this season, Exum could easily find himself as the starter next year, and with this increased aggressiveness in his offensive game coming around, he is definitely someone that a lot of people need to pay attention to. I want to go back to the European guys, Kevin, because there's a few more that are coming across this season that have been drafted previously. And a guy I really want to get your take on, he's a guy that I've been a fan of for quite a while, and that's Tomas Satoransky. How does your projections see him? How do you view him coming across? I think that he's going to be potentially the backup to John Wall and to Bradley Beal, and might even play some small forward this year and have a considerable role for the Wizards. Do your projections view him favourably?
Reasonably favorably. I mean, above replacement play, certainly, and that doesn't factor in that he's probably going to be a pretty good defender, I think, with his size at both guard spots, particularly when he's defending much smaller point guards along the lines of what we talked about with Exum and to a lesser extent Rubio. That size, I think, it's like having when teams cross match and put a wing on the point guard, but then you don't have to deal with the mismatch at the other position. So I always like to have that. I think the big thing that stands out in his translated European stats is, pretty efficient in his own right, just not a big factor in the offense is what he's projected to be. So that could work well if you put him next to Trey Burke, if Burke does end up winning that backup point guard job next to John Wall. But I watched a game the other night they played in the preseason, and Burke was sitting out that game. They used Satoransky as the backup to John Wall, who was making his preseason debut, and he looked very comfortable running the offense. So I was encouraged by what I saw there. And when you look at the fact that the Wizards don't have a lot of wing depth, I guess that's the one factor that might work against him playing point guard, is they just might need him on the wing because of the fact that they just really don't have, other than Kelly Oubre, who's still a bit of a question mark, they don't have a lot there behind Bradley Beal and Otto Porter. And you just have to sort of pencil in at this point that Bradley Beal's probably going to miss 20 games or more over the course of the season, which puts all the more pressure on Satoransky to play at that spot.
Satoransky, I believe, was a 50% shooter for Barcelona last year, and I think 40% from three, and I think he's been a 40% three-point shooter over the last couple of seasons. So while he didn't take a huge amount of shots, when he did, he took the right ones and he converted them. Just, you quickly touched on Oubre there. He's had a really exciting preseason. People are very interested in what he can do. I'm with you. I don't necessarily believe that he is going to be a starter-level player. Has anything that you've seen in preseason made you think, you know what, maybe Brooks is going to give him this starting job and maybe he is something different to what we expected? I still don't quite buy it with him, though.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, there's been some talk in Washington of a battle for the small forward job between Oubre and Porter, but to me, that starting lineup is pretty well, set in stone, and you're just looking for depth pieces around it.
The other guys coming across this season are Alex Abrines, Olivier Jean-Charles, Davis Bertin, Nicolas Brasino, and Lapro Vitola, I think that's how you pronounce it, who's looking to come over to San Antonio, or he is in San Antonio. Any of those guys stand out to you? Now, obviously, Abrines, Bertans, and Jean-Charles are guaranteed roster spots at this point. Brasino and Lapro Vitola, not necessarily, but do any of those guys stand out to you as being able to have an impact this season?
Abrines, I think, is the one guy there who's got a chance to really play a big role. And I still don't think he's going to play as much this season. It'll probably be more of an adjustment season for him. But down the road, the next couple of years, with Anthony Morrow being a free agent at the end of the year, I think he steps in, is their top wing out on the bench by next season if he develops as they hope. But he still even now brings a dimension they don't really have in terms of, Morrow is the only three-point shooter, really terrific three-point shooter they have on the perimeter, and he's such a defensive liability that he's never been able to finish games or play extended minutes. And Abrines, I think, eventually can get to that point where he's able to do those things, and then also brings more shot creation than Anthony Morrow does. So I like him the most of those guys for this year and beyond. Bertans, I think, has a chance to play because San Antonio is just so thin this year, and they don't have that stretch four now that Matt Bonner is no longer on the roster. It looks like Bertans is going to kind of step into that role. Jean-Charles, based on both seeing him in Summer League and then his translated European statistics, I'm just not sold he's an NBA caliber player. I think they kind of felt obligated to some extent to bring him over after drafting him in the first round a couple of years ago, but I would be surprised if he plays much at all this year. Same with Lapro Vitola, if he even makes the team. That's a really tough competition with a lot of guards in the mix there, and unlikely that he would get a chance to play unless there were injuries. Brasino is interesting because I had no expectations for him whatsoever based on his Argentinian statistics, and it's a little tough to translate from Argentina. Very, very rarely do we see players come to the NBA from there, but his stats looked pretty pedestrian for a guy coming to the NBA, and he has been a revelation so far in preseasons, just making every three-pointer he takes, and if he keeps that up, he'll certainly find his way on the court.
So he's got a battle with guys like Jonathan Gibson and Dorian Finney-Smith over in Dallas, and he looked. I watched him yesterday, maybe, or the day before, and he was hitting everything, and he looked like he was a significant part of the rotation. Not that he's going to play a huge amount when the season kicks off, but he's got a real chance of making the roster. Now, I want to go back just to Yabesele we talked about earlier, and just something that just came to my mind there. He's obviously playing in China this season. He's going to be playing for the Shanghai Sharks. We see the stats come out of China, and they look amazing. Like, they're through the roof. Like Jonathan Gibson, who we just mentioned, he averaged 42 points a game. Like, didn't score 42 in a game. He averaged 42 points a game. The China stats, their pace is through the roof. The talent disparity is significant. So when we see Yabesele's numbers and he comes back averaging 30 and 15 or something like that, how much of a discount do you take off that? How does the translation look for that? Like, it's a significant drop, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's much higher than any other league, and there's a couple of reasons for that. First off, it's the pace of play is really fast. These guys who are imports play a ton of minutes over there because of the fact that there's so much dependence on them for shot creation. So basically, other than the rare Yijian Lian or teams with those kind of that kind of NBA caliber talent who happens to be Chinese, otherwise, basically their domestic players on the roster are role players. They're going to defend, they're going to space the floor, they're going to rebound, and you're just going to give it to the import and clear the floor for them to score. So what you see is don't tend to be particularly efficient playing in China, but put up these huge usage rates and scoring averages. And so, yeah, that's something that's actually fairly trivial then to adjust for when you're doing the NBA projections, because of the fact that you consistently see guys drop off in terms of their scoring so much when they come to the NBA. Or then I've also looked at the D League in that case.
Everyone also needs to pay attention to Norris Cole, who's over there at the moment. So he's going to put up huge numbers. I don't believe that Norris Cole is a very good player at all. I think he's a below average NBA contributor, but he's going to go over there. He's going to put up big numbers, and people are going to be, oh, look, Norris Cole now got signed at the end of the Chinese season, so we need to look at him in fantasy. But the numbers he's going to put up over there are going to be astronomical. There's almost no doubt. And he's going to come to the NBA and not really going to make much of an impact at all. So I think that's just something that people need to pay attention to. I want to talk to you something stylistically about the NBA, Kevin. We saw when the Thunder knocked off the Spurs last season, they did it by going big. When the trend of the NBA is going small, how do you see that trend going? Do you think that more teams will start to go big? We're seeing Sacramento do it at the moment, running DeMarcus Cousins and Costa Koufos as a starting combination. Do you see more teams maybe looking to go the other way to try and combat the small ball lineups that the Warriors have brought in? Or is that just a case of that can work occasionally, but it's not going to be something that works all the time?
Well, I think we certainly are going to see teams do it because there are as many talented big men, maybe more out there as there were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and it's just less opportunity for them now because of the fact that teams are so focused on skilled players and playing faster and spacing the floor and all of that. So, basically, if you're choosing between, if you think of this in like video game terms, if you're choosing between a small forward or a combo forward who's a 70 and a big man who's a 75 or an 80, some teams are inevitably going to choose that big man who's a 75 or an 80 because just on sheer talent, that's the better player. And then there's also just only so many wings who are skilled enough to really be an upgrade on those big men to go around. So if you don't have enough of those, you probably are going to play traditionally. But I've never totally bought into the whole, you got to zig while everyone else is zig while everyone else is zagging, or vice versa. To me, that's overstated a little bit, that you're going to be able to dominate with the counter strategies. I mean, I think what happened last year with Oklahoma City against San Antonio is because of the fact that San Antonio was itself relatively traditional, although they had jump shooting big men, they didn't really have the ability to make Oklahoma City pay for playing as big as they were. And then you saw Golden State in the next round. I mean, obviously the Warriors are, the most extreme example of this possible, but if you have a guy like Draymond Green, you're not overmatched when an opponent plays two traditional and big men. And yet at the same time, you still get all the benefits at the other end of having a skilled player at power forward who spaces the floor. So, I think there are enough of those out there that I don't think it's going to be an effective counter strategy on a general basis.
I think that one thing I think the NBA may move to a little bit more is something that Utah is definitely focusing on, and that is, instead of necessarily going small or having stretch fours, is having ball handling fours or ball handling big men and being able to distribute, say, the point guard role amongst 4 of the 5 starters, 5 of the 5 starters, have anyone be able to grab a rebound and take the ball up the court and initiate some sort of offense. Can you see that? Look, Utah's definitely doing that way. I spoke to Joe Ingles earlier in the year, and he said, look, that's something that the Quinn Snyder definitely looks at. Everyone has to be able to dribble. Everyone has to be able to initiate. Everyone has to be able to run a play. Do you see that as something that the league may be looking to, instead of that stretch for, a playmaking for?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's probably in addition to, as opposed to instead of, but, and you look at Trey Lyles in Utah, it kind of gives them the best of both worlds because of the fact that he can shoot it in addition to handling the ball. But, first off, you've got more options. You've just got more places to go with the basketball. And then second off, like I talked about with David Locke on Locked On NBA last week on the Mothership program, power forwards just aren't used to defending pick and rolls on the ball. That's not something they do on a regular basis. So if you can force them to do that, that's an advantage to you, as opposed to, point guards are constantly defending them. So that's all of that, I think, are reasons why, that will continue to be something that playmaking will continue to be something that teams look for in their power forwards, in addition to shooting ability.
One thing I want to get your opinion on this, because this is something that I've seen, not without really any sort of hard evidence, just an observation that I've made, is that the talent level in the NBA seems to be increasing. Not necessarily at the top end, but in the middle ranges. That there's, you would have had, in general in the past, here are my 5 starters on the team, and they are significantly better than the next 5 guys on the bench. The way that I seem to look at it now is that teams will have 2 or 3 guys who are upper echelon, and then they'll have 7 or 8 guys that are almost interchangeable, meaning that we're going to not see 5 starters play 33 minutes each. We're going to see just a spread of guys where the coach will go, okay, everyone's going to play 26 minutes a night, 27 minutes a night, and on some nights you'll play 30, on some nights you'll play 22. Do you see that increase in talent in the NBA is a real thing? It's not just a figment of my imagination, that the depth is actually improving, and that coaches are going to be able to spread those rotations and use more matchup-based situations depending on how the game's going, depending on who they're matching up against, depending on numerous situations?
No, I think it is a real effect. I mean, first off, you look at the fact that the number of teams in the league has stayed the same since 2004-05. We're now in our 13th season of a 30-team league, and at the same time, the talent pool is continuing to increase because of the fact that you see an increased number of minutes going to international players every year. It keeps setting highs on basically an annual basis, or maybe it's every other year. So inevitably that's going to mean more talent. And then I think the other thing that's happened now is with the increase of the salary cap, it makes the NBA a lot more competitive with international leagues in terms of bringing over some of these guys who, are a star in Europe, but a 10th man in the NBA. So you look at this year, Sergio Rodriguez coming back from Spain, Malcolm Delaney with the Hawks, who they signed relatively cheaply, but had been over in Europe for a while. So there's a few guys like that, a couple years ago when the cap was lower, they probably wouldn't be here. They would still be in Europe in that situation. And the flip side of that is you see a number of veterans in the league who were guys who, are kind of marginal, but probably NBA players who just couldn't find a job this summer. Josh Smith, after his disappointing season, somewhat surprisingly couldn't find a job. A guy like Thomas Robinson, who I think showed enough potential last year in Brooklyn that he probably merited a roster spot, but there just wasn't one out there, so he settled for a non-guaranteed camp deal for the Lakers. And there's a surprising number of players like that, and that to me suggests growth of talent. Now, I haven't really thought about how that affects projections. I know it makes it more difficult. For me, there's a lot more like difficult choices when I'm projecting out minutes and playing time. And, sometimes you just kind of split it and say, well, there's a 50% chance this guy ends up in the rotation and a 50% chance that this other guy ends up in the rotation. So we'll just give them half of the rotation minutes and split it that way. But yeah, it's interesting. I guess that does give teams more options in terms of playing different styles on different nights.
And that's exactly where my question came from, is doing projections and looking at these minutes and looking at teams and going, well, I can see 13 of these guys who could potentially be in the rotation every night, but teams aren't going to go 13 deep. So they're going to be nights where some guys don't play at all, or they play 10 minutes and then they play 25 minutes. And that phenomenon seemed to have increased this season. So that's where I got the thought from. So it's good to see that you back that up. One last question before we go, Kevin. The rookie class. Back to the rookies again. It's been mentioned as a weaker crop than what we've seen the last couple of years, weaker than what's coming the next couple of seasons after that. And that means that I see a lot of rookies who aren't really in clear positions to get significant minutes, to get 30 minutes a night. How many rookies do you think actually play a significant role this season? There would have been Simmons, but obviously he's not going to play for the majority of the season. But there's not a huge amount of guys who seemed locked in as being, this guy is a starter, he's going to get 30 minutes, is there?
Yeah, which is why I think that Simmons, if he's more towards the optimistic end of the timetable for the metatarsal injury that he suffered, he could still come back and win Rookie of the Year, because to me there's not another obvious candidate. I mean, Brandon Ingram's coming off the bench as the number 2 pick so far. Maybe eventually he slides to shooting guard and that's how he gets into the starting lineup. Dragan Bender is going to be brought along slowly. Jaylen Brown is going to play limited minutes. Even Chris Dunn, who might be the most NBA ready of the top 10 picks, at least outside of Simmons, he's going to be playing off the bench at the start of the season. So, yeah, I mean, Marquise Chris has played a fair amount for Phoenix so far in the preseason. Looks like he's going to merit a fairly large role, but it's not a ton of guys. Dario Saric then steps in, I guess, for Simmons as the starter probably in Philadelphia at power forward, and he maybe then becomes the top of that heap as far as guys who are actually going to play a lot of minutes.
One guy that I think is going to play more minutes than I expected is Domantas Sabonis, who appears like he's going to be the starter in Oklahoma City, and he could be a guy that's a top three player in rookie minutes this season, and that I don't think many people would have expected that at the start of the season.
Absolutely not. Yeah, I mean, he was in an interesting spot where he could have gone. There was enough competition in the Oklahoma City front court that it was realistic that he could have slid behind Joffrey Laverne and not even been in that rotation at all. But yeah, it does seem like they like him as the starting power forward right now, and still will probably be in that 20 to 24 minute a night range, I would guess. But that's more than we expected.
Definitely. Kevin, thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing your insight on all these topics that we discussed. If everyone is not following you on Twitter, where can they do that?
At K Pelton.
And have you got any articles that are due to come out anytime soon that you want to give a plug to?
Mostly just continuing the Insider 5-on-5s as the season previews. So that's going to be most of it. Although I do have something that's a little out of my usual wheelhouse coming next week, so you can look forward to that on the site.
So check out ESPN and ESPN Insider, where Kevin's stuff is. Go and check all that stuff out. Obviously follow him on Twitter. But if you're not following him on Twitter and you listen to this podcast, I'd be stunned. So if you're not, go and correct that immediately. Kevin, thank you for spending the time and coming on today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.